Well, it took a while, but I'm finally back with a second video. And as you can see, I'm going to be showing you how I go about making a rustic loaf of sourdough bread. I've been making bread at home for more than a few years now, and I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and I hope I can share some of those lessons with you today. The first lesson I've learned is to measure my ingredients by weight instead of volume, which is why I have this trusty scale here, which has definitely seen better days. Measurements are in grams and not ounces, and it is more precise that way, but there can be a bit of a learning curve if you're not used to it. What I'm adding first here is about 50 grams of a mature sourdough culture, or maybe you've heard the term sourdough starter or mother dough. I can explain in a lot more detail in a future video, but this sourdough culture contains the yeast that are going to make your bread rise and bacteria that are going to flavor your bread. I followed that up with 25 grams of very well filtered water because I'm paranoid about my water, like the little girl from the movie Signs, if you've ever seen that film, and about 25 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour. Adding this amount of flour gives the yeast in the starter just sort of a giant meal when for a week in the refrigerator they've just been grazing at a very slow pace on the nutrients in the starter. As those yeast become more and more active with the new flour, they're going to release carbon dioxide. This process takes anywhere from a couple of hours to a half day depending on the temperature of your environment. Whether you have a very active, fast-moving starter or a slow-moving starter is really going to impact how long it takes for your dough to rise. What I have now is 100 total grams of the sourdough starter or culture, and I'm adding to that 250 grams of, again, very filtered water. The water is a bit colder than room temperature, so that is one of the factors that's going to slow down how quickly my dough rises. And to the mixture, I'm now adding 450 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour. There's not really a particular reason I prefer unbleached flour. It's just a preference. And the last thing I added was 15 grams of coarse kosher salt. Now, in any profession or hobby or any area of general interest, there are going to be purists who just insist that things must be done a particular way. So there are some who might look on in horror as I add salt at this point because they just believe salt is going to massacre all the yeast before the dough gets a chance to mix and rise. I've actually found the bread making process to be very forgiving of when you add your ingredients, and you really just have to find the process that works for you. It's kind of like going on a road trip with a group of people and you're traveling in different cars. And maybe somewhere along the way you get separated and you end up taking different routes. And some of you may get to the destination sooner and some of you may get there later. But at the end of the day, you all made it there, and that's really the important part. My initial plan here was actually just to incorporate the ingredients and let them sit for about a half hour to just absorb the water. But the dough I'm working with is a bit drier than I'm used to working with. So I just started kneading to make sure everything was well hydrated. And now I'm going to come back just every 30 to 45 minutes to check up on the dough and maybe give it a little more kneading or stretching. Now, a half hour later, it may not look like much has changed, and on the surface, that appears to be true. But on a level we can't see yet, the yeast are already breaking down the nutrients in the flour, and as the flour particles separate, they are starting to form gluten strands. That's probably a word you've heard presented in a very negative light, but gluten is really the structural foundation of your bread. As the flour breaks down, gluten strands develop, and these strands begin to cling to one another, and they begin to stretch and form a big web. And when you're kneading your dough, you're helping that process along. You're not just really pounding the dough into the bowl, you are making small stretches. What I'm doing here is actually called a slap and fold, which is typically done with a dough that's more wet and sticky. But I wanted to show you just some of the methods that can be used to help develop that gluten network. Every time you're stretching that dough and folding it over itself, you're just helping those gluten strands get longer and longer and form more connections, which makes the web just get stronger over time. And a half hour later, you can already see that process start to occur as I stretch that dough out, which I couldn't do just the time before, and fold it over itself. That network is just lengthening and getting stronger. But if you notice at this point, I can only stretch it a couple of times before those strands reach their limit. So I actually return to just the simple kneading process at this point. I figure the more I help it along, the easier it's going to be the next time around. But you can actually see that the dough's starting to develop a shape. It's starting to kind of hold its own form as that gluten develops. Another half hour later, the dough sort of keeping the shape that I left it in, and it looks like the stretching is going maybe just a little bit better than the last time around. It still doesn't have a whole lot of give, but as long as that process is continuing, I'm pleased with it. I'm actually wetting my hands as I do this because even though the dough was not so sticky when it first started out, it is becoming a bit more sticky as it starts to mature. And this is the last time I'm actually going to stretch and fold the dough and knead it before I just leave it to time to do the process. Because it's such a dry dough compared to what I normally work with, I figured just letting the dough sit by itself and let those gluten strands form by themselves would be the best way to go. So I'm going to wrap this up one more time, which you don't see, but this is about 4 hours after I put that cover on the last time. And as you can see, the dough has kept its shape. It's full of gases now, and the aroma coming out of it is very pleasantly sour. Another lesson to remember is that it is important to have a well-floured table or board so that your dough does not stick to it when you turn it out. This may be another time when a purist may just insist that you don't pat your dough down when you turn it out onto a table. You're just going to lose all your gas bubbles and it's just going to be ruined. And I'm telling you, dough is just not that delicate. Those yeast are going to keep on working once you get your loaf shaped, and that's what I'm doing here. As I sort of tuck the dough under itself, maybe for lack of a better phrase, I'm adding some surface tension, but this is not the final shape I'm using. I'm going to let it sit for about 20 minutes and rest, and come back, lightly flour the top, and give the dough its final shape. I kind of fold it like an envelope. And I just really want you to understand what you're seeing right here is really just one of the simple joys in life for me. While this isn't the time and place to overshare, like many other people, I deal with my own mental health issues and traumas that I have to work through. But this process of making bread, especially these moments right here, are just so pure and unadulterated in the enjoyment I get from them. I could even say in a way, I don't just make bread because I like to, I make bread because I need to. And every loaf of bread I make has its own special role in that process. So this special little guy is going to proof in the refrigerator overnight, and here I am about 12 hours later. I'm going to preheat my oven to 500 degrees, and I'm going to set my Dutch oven in there for about a half hour so it can get really nice and hot. Professional bread bakers have ovens in which they can inject steam, and that steam prevents the crust of the bread from forming too quickly. And that allows the bread to get a really nice rise while it bakes. So although most of us likely don't have steam injectors in our own home ovens, we can recreate that environment on a much smaller scale by putting our loaf inside the Dutch oven and allowing the moisture in the dough to humidify that small environment, thus creating its own steam. And this is just a really good looking loaf here. I'm going to score it with a razor blade. I'm going to do kind of like a tic-tac-toe pattern. If I have a more oval loaf, I like to just cut it lengthwise one time across the loaf, but I figured I would go for a bit more rustic of a look here. So I took the Dutch oven out maybe 2 minutes before I put this dough inside. I'm going to cover that back up, and always be very careful when you're handling such a hot piece of equipment. I'm going to put that back in the oven for about 20 to 25 minutes. Well, suppose you don't have a Dutch oven. If you have a pizza stone and an old tray that you can put water on, you can cook your loaf on the pizza stone, add some hot water for steam, get that closed up real quick, and you may not get the exact same results, but it will work in a pinch. About 25 minutes into the bake, I want to uncover that Dutch oven because I don't need the humidity anymore. The dough's already gotten a really good rise, and at this point it's not just a dough, it's a nice loaf. And now without the steam, I can focus on browning the loaf. And what you see here is just a beautiful finished loaf coming out of the oven. I'm not sure how well the camera communicates this, but in case it looks burnt to you, I assure you it's not. It's really just a very dark caramelized brown, and allowing your bread to get nice and brown, which plenty of people are afraid to do, really allows for a deeper flavor of your overall outcome. So as I look at the crumb on the inside, it may not be as porous as I'm used to. Here's a stressful moment here. Yeah, how's that for anxiety? Trying to not cause any tears. And again, the camera may not show it very well, but the inside, or what we call the crumb, just has a very glossy, gelatinous appearance to it. It's a really nice look. And the last lesson I almost forgot to share was always, always, always wait for your loaf to cool completely before you slice into it. If you can be that patient and you slice into it, you're going to get a very gummy texture to your bread, and it's not going to be as enjoyable as you would like it to be. Now, my ritual every time I make a loaf of bread is to take the first slice and enjoy it with a little bit of olive oil with some herbs and spices and some grated Parmesan cheese. I can't forget salt and a little bit of pepper. And that's how I make a very basic loaf of sourdough bread. I have to confess, the reason it took so long to make a second video is because I'm still just trying to figure out what I want this channel to be about, what I want to communicate with you, and how I want to do it. And one of the things I've been trying to figure out is how I want to sign off at the end of each video. And I think I finally have it, and it comes from a lesson I've been learning the past few years about how everyone truly deserves to be loved and accepted exactly as they are. You don't have to earn it. So, I will see you down the road. And until then, know that you are loved. Peace, everyone.